Welcome everybody, and if you are caught sneaking looks at the ongoing India-Pakistan match, please, you'll be forgiven, but only if you are prepared to tell us when a wicket falls. And it's pretty evenly matched. Yesterday, 24 hours ago, I said there was a 50-50 chance that either side could win, and I maintained that, and that seems to be the case. Pakistan has just lost its second wicket. Third, since we came down the stairs. Gosh. Okay, so it's still finely balanced. But we are going to focus and talk about billionaires. I have two terrific panelists with me here. James Crabtree, as many of you know, published a book last year called The Billionaire Raj. How many of you have at least seen it, if not read it? Excellent. So there are people who know the book. And Avi Singh, who is a criminal lawyer based in Delhi, is going to be in conversation. We're all going to talk about it. Of course, to talk about Indian billionaires and the Indian elite in London on a summer's day seems entirely the appropriate thing to do. It says, looking at the Indian elite, you just look around yourself in London, you bump into them, depending on where you hang out. You'll never find them on the London Underground, for instance, but you do find them if you go to the right places. So what we thought we'd do is have a fairly free-flowing, you must be tired as an audience. I think our speakers are struggling as well with energy levels. I certainly am. But we'll have a fairly free-flowing conversation where we want to look at the rise of the billionaires, this extraordinary rise of some people having made a lot of money, but also behind it a larger trend of growing inequality. In India, but also elsewhere. In India, the story that is told internationally is of the growth of the Indian economy. But as we know, the growth of the Indian economy has really benefited the top 20% of the country. And the rest of the country really hasn't done well out of it. And economists who are unafraid to speak truth to power have been pointing out the dangers of the middle income trap. So there is a wider economic story behind the rise of the billionaires. But I'm going to invite James to first tell us a little bit about his book, which throws out a lot of these issues. And then we'll talk about crony capitalism, anti-corruption laws, London, fugitive billionaires. I mean, it's all around us. So why don't you start, James?
Thank you very much for being here. As you say, it's sort of fitting that we are in the spiritual home of the Indian billionaire to talk about this topic in London. Often when I was trying to interview, I spent 5 years living in India working as a foreign correspondent in Mumbai for the Financial Times. And more often than not, when I tried to interview Indian billionaires, it turned out that they had come to London and weren't available for interview. As the sort of the British elite in the colonial era used to go to the hill stations of Shimla, the Indian elite now go to the hill stations of Kensington and Chelsea for the summer to escape. And I was told by, when the book came out, the book was heavily lawyered. So it's a good job we've got a lawyer on the panel. So I had 3 different publishers, and so I had more than 3 different sets of lawyers who crawled over this text to see if we were going to get sued by various of the dubious characters who were written about there. And somebody said, well, James, it doesn't really matter, because if you get sued in India, you're set. You can just flee from Indian justice and move back to London. Anyway, so I moved to India in 2011, and I sort of became captivated by Indian tycoons. So if some proportion of you in this audience are not from South Asia, and if you're a Brit or an American, we have Richard Branson, and I guess we have people like Elon Musk maybe, but the idea of a tycoon, the head of a family-owned distributed conglomerate of the sort that you have in India, is a kind of dying or dead breed. And the very first day I moved to India, I landed in the old Mumbai airport and drove down to the house that we had rented in the south of the city, and we drove down past Antilia, the home of Mukesh Ambani, who apparently is watching the cricket match this afternoon. And the driver, it's the only time the driver said anything on the drive south all the way through the city, pointed through the windshield and said, Sir, look, Ambani House," as if this was the most remarkable thing in the city. And for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, this is the residential skyscraper that is the home of India's richest man. People call it the billion-dollar home. Mr. Ambani and his wife and their 3 children live there with, innumerable servants, 6 floors of parking, 3 helipads, allegedly a snow room, which is a kind of sauna in reverse that you can go to escape the Mumbai heat. And this building, which I went past almost every day, and how many of you are from Mumbai here? So you can't avoid this building. You've got to go past it anywhere you go in the city, up and down through Midtown Mumbai. And it's a remarkable building. Even in London, in New York, in Moscow, wherever the global super rich exist, there is no building like Antilia that stands almost as a kind of new strata of wealth, particularly in a city like Mumbai, where so many people live with so little. And so as I was going around reporting on other things in India, just became more and more interested in the Indian super rich, how in a country that many people perceive incorrectly, but perceive to be very poor, how did this new strata of very, very wealthy people emerge? How did they make their money? And also, what were they like? I mean, I was curious about who these people were, what made them tick. Many people saw them as crony capitalists, is the phrase that you use. You have many Indian super rich people who are very admirable, who made their money in IT services or kind of respectable industries, but there are many of the new super rich who have been kind of tarred with the brush of crony capitalism, but they obviously don't see themselves that way. And so I was interested psychologically in who these people were and what they thought they were doing and what the compromises they thought they were making.
So who was the most vulgar of them all? Okay.
No, well, the most fun story in the book, for those of you who are tempted to read it, occurred about 2 miles that way. So I was desperate to interview Vijay Mallya, who I guess most of you in this room will know, the Kingfisher tycoon. For those of you who don't, picture a combination of Richard Branson and Keith Richards or Hugh Hefner. And so he now lives in exile in London, because he's the preeminent sort of exile tycoon, because his business affairs collapsed. And so I went to his extremely gaudy house, a very huge mansion on the side of Regent's Park, and got to interview him for 3 or 4 hours one afternoon, where he unburdened himself to me over glasses of whiskey about how he had been wronged and how all of the things people accused him of as the poster child of corruption in India were inadequate. And so I suppose that was the most fun. He was the most flamboyant and the most interesting and the most sort of talkative and garrulous of the tycoons.
So was there any, did they feel defensive about their wealth at any point? I mean, did they feel like they had to explain why they had got rich? Or was there a sense of entitlement behind it?
So India is a very nice place to be a foreign correspondent. I now live in Singapore, and the further east you go in Asia, the more difficult it is to interact with powerful people, whether those are politicians or business tycoons. If you are a foreign correspondent in China, then this is a fascinating job, but your odds of speaking to a senior Chinese politician or a senior Chinese businessman are virtually zero. And with the exception of Ambani and to some degree Modi himself, who are difficult to get to, almost everyone else, if you push and you work for if you're fortunate enough to work for a prominent Western media organization, you can get to talk to these people. And yeah, so I did find that most of them felt that they were misunderstood, particularly the ones who had a bad reputation. So I spoke to Vijay Mallya, to Gautam Adani, to the Jindal brothers, to a whole host of characters who didn't make it into the book. And typically, yeah, they obviously didn't see themselves as purveyors, as crony capitalism. They saw themselves as nationalists, as builders of India, people who were in very difficult circumstances making the steel mills and the roads and the airlines that you need to move from being a poor country to a middle income to being a rich country. And so that psychology, the sort of the distance between particularly what many in the kind of right-thinking Indian upper middle classes who were rather suspicious of characters like Vijay Mallya and were worried that they were bending all the rules and not doing things in the right way, and who admired the Tatars and the Nandan Nilekanis, the Infosys tycoons of this world. And I think people like Mallya did have a chip on their shoulder, that they wanted respectability. Yeah. They wanted to be accepted as business titans who were impressive in their own right. They didn't want to be kind of tarred with this other vision of a kind of cronyistic model of business.
Thank you. Avi, can I ask you to take off from there and talk about the different sectors through which these billionaires have come through? Everybody hasn't made their money in the same industries, right? They're all, somebody's in mining, there's IT, you have Rahul Bajaj, Ratan Tata, Azim Premji in one kind of category of the super rich.
None of them are in my good book. They're all the good guys.
Which is why I named them. And clearly they are the foil for your interlocutors. But do you want to talk a little bit about these different sectors and how differently they make money?
Absolutely. I mean, it is a sense of very different political economies coexisting. So, you come out 1991, there's liberalization, and everything is sort of suppressed. And you go into private capital is good. You have privatization of public services, you have privatization of mining, and you have the software industry, which is, there's really two Indian industries which are integrated into the global supply chain. It's software and to some extent automobile spare parts of all things. And that's a different kind of political economy which requires global integration, which has fairly respectable companies operating on global standards. And then you've got, many of the people you're writing about, not all, but most of them, who are operating in either spheres like mining, which require sort of privatization of national resources owned by the government, or in some kind of government contracting, which requires a high degree, even in telecom, of discretion by the government. And one interesting thing is in 2010, the two biggest exports from India, one was software exports, which everybody talks about, and the second was iron ore. So you have two very different political economies competing with each other. And the best example of this is Bangalore versus Bellary. Bellary is the Reddy brothers, which you've written about in your book, which is, been to jail, numerous corruption cases, entangled with a former chief minister of Karnataka, and Bangalore is the capital of Karnataka, which has Infosys and many of the software players. And those two seem to operate, in one is California, one is the Democratic Republic of the Congo's political economy. It's almost that disparate. And that leads to different kinds of responses, different kinds of involvement of money in politics, different kind of corruptions, and definitely different kinds of rule of law problems.
Yeah. So this money, if we were to move away just from their industries, in order to, what we've seen, especially with this 2019 election, is the enormous influence that money can buy you in politics.
Yeah.
Right? That's one thing that we've seen. Now, how many of your billionaires, James, are in that game of buying influence, of controlling the media, of buying politicians? The Reddy brothers are the most obvious example, but...
So one of the things I was fascinated in the book, as I said, was sort of who are the tycoons and what makes them tick, and the other was corruption. And I don't want to claim that those of us who are from the US or Western country, there's no corruption in our countries, but it's not as front of mind. And I was also fascinated by the kind of tradecraft of corruption. So I arrived in India, and it was in the midst of this period that we're talking about where there were many scams: coal scam, iron ore scam, 2G scam. And I was deeply curious about how exactly this happened. What was the mechanism? Were we talking about, suitcases full of cash delivered in the middle of the night? Was it something more subtle? And what became clear, this is happening a little bit less now, but in a sense the sophistication was that you had this merging of business and politics. Crony capitalism kind of tends to be defined as collusion between the business and the political elite. And so in India, in the middle of the 2000s and onwards, you had this phenomenon where the politicians were becoming business people because they no longer wanted simply to be the recipients of a kind of a suitcase full of money. They wanted equity upside. And so you would see kind of politicians, either themselves or in some client sense, beginning to kind of take control of business entities in the kind of businesses that you were talking about, iron ore or mining, property, construction in particular. And it worked the other way too. So the business people were becoming politicians. So Vijay Mallya was a member of the upper house. There were, and it's continued on in this election as well, an increasing number of elected officials who had substantial business holdings of one sort or another, simply because it made it easier to work the system. If much of your business advantage comes from being able to gain favorable regulations, it helps to have, a hand on both sides of the house, as it were. And so this, in a sense, added another question, which is about the nature of being a politician. I was immensely curious about the good politicians and how they kind of tried to be honest, given that it's impossible, literally impossible, to become a member of the Indian lower house of parliament or a state legislature without accepting illegal bribes. Like you can't do it because otherwise you'll get outspent. And so I asked on kind of deep background various friendly politicians, some of whom may or may not have been appearing at this festival, kind of how they managed it. What was it that what were the compromises that they had to do if you were to try and stay as honest as you possibly could in a system that made it incredibly difficult to do that because the system required money in order to win. So
yeah. Avi, can you tell us what is, following on from that, what has happened with anti-corruption law then? Has it changed? Because the 2014 election, of course, saw a change in government principally on the issue of corruption. That election was fought on an anti-corruption platform. People were fed up of the scams that James has just mentioned. Has the tradecraft, what was your term? Tradecraft of corruption, yeah. Which is wonderful. Has the tradecraft of corruption got better? Or has corruption lessened? Why are there no scams now?
Well, I think in an earlier session that you had, the former Chief Election Commissioner, Mr. Chawla, said that there's a report that 60,000 crores was spent in this election.
It's $9 billion for those of you who don't do crores, which is a very big number.
Thank you. I never managed translating it on the fly. That's a very big number. It's also more than double the last election's number. And that money hasn't come from, shall we say, entirely legitimate sources. So that'll give you an indication of what's happened with corruption. But I think the tradecraft, that's a good phrase to it, or the mechanism of corruption has changed. I would say it's become less artisanal, it's become less diversified, it's become, it's more centralized, it's become more organized, and also it's become sort of harder to catch. So we've had an amendment in the Prevention of Corruption Act, which has ostensibly been done to decrease corruption. Of course, nobody does a corruption to allow corruption, at least not publicly.
No, yes.
But what it's done is given the government greater control. So you actually need the government's permission before you file a case against a public servant. The kind of sections of the law which allow 2G cases to be registered have been done away with. So you can't actually have a case for exercising discretion in a particular way. And you also have certain other things that have been done away with. What's been added is sort of corporate corruption, much like exists in the UK, etc. And what we have is that there's been a lot of cases of using the anti-corruption laws to go after, shall we say, political opposition, right? But not entirely any use of it to go after anybody within the government or close to the government. So it's been very selective enforcement, which gives an appearance that corruption has actually decreased. So we had very bad era of corruption before 2014, and now there is a government which doesn't have any corruption. That's not true because we see the cases out there which are there, or the iceberg sort of visibility of it. And secondly, what we see is there's less enforcement of particular kinds of organized corruption, particularly in financing of elections, etc.
Right. So in this massive, what was it, 9 billion?
9 billion, yeah.
Of the election spending this time, the key mechanism for this has been electoral bonds.
Well,
no. The electoral bonds is a tiny fraction of that. So that's it's a bit of needle in a haystack guesswork. But the methodology they use is to sort of try and ask individual people, did you get bribed? Did you know anyone else who got bribed? And so they have a complex methodology to arrive at that figure. But the electoral bonds, the legitimate route by which you're meant to give money, is a tiny, small fraction of that.
Okay, so the large part of the 9 billion that you're talking about is cash.
Illegal donation, illegal spending, yeah.
Right, and that has to be a rough figure because you never know what,
Yeah.
what is being spent. But if we just think about electoral bonds for a minute, which has been presumably part of the cleaning up act, so to speak, the tradecraft of making electoral finance more transparent, but actually has made it very opaque, right?
Yeah, well,
that's
there's nothing transparent about electoral bonds, absolutely.
Yeah. So do you want to talk about electoral bonds? Because that's not always widely understood.
So electoral bonds are bonds you can buy through banks to finance political parties. They are, by definition, opaque because nobody is supposed to know, including the political parties, but of course they can usually figure it out, who actually bought the bonds. So you can't actually determine who's paying the political contributions legitimately through the banking system, which industries are paying which party, and that's been a case which has come up with the Supreme Court, and the constitutionality of it was challenged. And the Supreme Court said, we'll figure it out afterwards, let's have the election first. And on the 31st of May, we want the banks to tell us who bought these bonds. Well, it is now in the middle of June, and nobody's bothered, and nobody's scared to ask, because apparently once you have a victory, then we don't have to ask any more questions.
And the key thing about electoral bonds is because they come through the State Bank of India,
Yeah.
the government of India is the only party that knows this information, right? And therefore,
Yeah.
it is no surprise what we did learn in the middle of May before the results came, that 95% of electoral bonds money went to a single political party, and there are no prizes for guessing which one it is.
Yeah, I mean, you have a political economy problem here, and I mean, India is not unique. The same problem exists in the U.S., which is also a hypercharged, big money democracy. But India is at a much earlier stage in its economic development, racing away with a kind of super high cost model that. I mean, India is only $2,000 per capita, and it's already spending more money than an American presidential, congressional, senatorial combined. And reforming that is incredibly difficult because the ruling party, in this case the BJP, has zero incentive to reform because they are the main beneficiary of the system. Even if you are not corrupt, you are the main beneficiary while in power of more corporate donations.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, Modi has made the system worse. I think it would be fair to say that he's done nothing to drive out illegal money, and the electoral bonds system has made the old system more opaque, and it benefits the BJP more. And so, the problem of illegal money going into Indian politics and the mysterious quid pro quos that almost certainly have to go along with that is worse than it was 5 years ago.
I mean, if I may just add to that, there was other amendment with regard to campaign financing. So the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, which has basically been used as a hammer against non-governmental organizations, including Greenpeace, and Caveat has been one of my clients, to do sort of, or Amnesty, etc., to freeze up their getting money from abroad and take away their permissions, was amended with support both from the Congress and the BJP to allow companies, multinational companies, to contribute to these parties. So there was sort of a conspiracy between the two parties to allow foreign capital, which can't be used for political purposes, and that's the charges against the NGO, that they're being used for political purposes by campaigning, for example, for cleaner environment or better human rights laws, but they can be used to contribute to the BJP or the Congress or any other political party. And that was an amendment brought in the last 5 years.
Right. How many of your billionaires, James, have also invested in buying media houses?
I mean, one of them in particular. Ruchir Sharma in his book has a kind of checklist of, if you want to see a kind of an Indian oligarch, normally at the state level, at the kind of mid-tier, if you go to a second-tier city, then you find a businessman who owns a newspaper, a hospital, couple of schools, and then you've got the kind of the big figure in town, because you can use these are mechanisms of power. If you have a hospital, then you can offer people healthcare at your hospital, you can put their kids through school, and you own a newspaper because that's useful. And so there has been a kind of concentration of media ownership in India, in which Mukesh Ambani in particular stands out as a kind of has recreated himself as a media tycoon. And the oligarchs are very good at using not just the media but also the legal system. So I am presently being sued for a very large amount of money by Anil Ambani, the junior former billionaire, I now get to say, given he's lost most of his money. And not uniquely, a large number of journalists and media organizations have been taken to court on entirely frivolous grounds by this particular billionaire. For writing, very reasonable stories saying that he wasn't very good at running his businesses. And this has been true for a number of the larger kind of business houses, that they're very aggressive in their use of the legal system to kind of bully independent journalism. There's not a sense that any damages ever get paid in these cases, but it's such a pain to try and fight your way through the lower and then eventually the upper echelons of the Indian court system. This takes years and years and years.
Keeps people like Avi in work.
Right. Well, this was my first question to Avi, was how many of these guys did he work for? But it turns out he's on the side of the angels and acts for the nice people.
Yes, I only defend innocent people, absolutely.
But yeah, I mean, there has been a concentration of media ownership in India. Again, not unique to India. This is a problem that many democracies face, that there is often a kind of fealty between media and power and money. But that has been a trend that worries a lot of people in India over the last 5 or 10 years.
And one thing that I noticed during the 2019 campaign was what, of course, a number of people have pointed out, is the extensive use, not just of media, but social media, and in particular WhatsApp. And the circulation of false information through WhatsApp forwards is something that, everybody has noticed. Academics are studying. WhatsApp is funding research to look into this themselves. But what is probably less talked about is what Mukesh Ambani said. Data is the new oil. Right? So there is very little regulation. The fact that there is very little regulation of personal data, that you can, if you have the workforce, any political party that has the workforce of people who are willing to send out messages and call phone numbers, 30,000 a day, it is possible to get hold of this information, and the person at the other end has cheap data plans on their phones, whereby things like WhatsApp can work as well. And so this is a sort of post your book phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, I was in India for the election and spent 10 days traipsing around in incredibly hot weather in West Bengal and Uttar Pradesh, trying to get a sense of what was going on, and as with everyone else, completely not seeing the wave coming. But I was particularly impressed that you could be in the most rural part of a village in Uttar Pradesh, and you now have blisteringly fast 4G on your phone, much better than in England. It's almost as good as Singapore. I've been in Oxford for some of the last week, and the 4G is pathetic compared to rural Uttar Pradesh. And that is, in a sense, the upside of the downside of having Mukesh Ambani, because by his spending $40 odd billion on his geo network, he has catapulted India to the forefront of a certain kind of digital revolution. Data is cheaper in India than any country on earth, and it's having a dramatic social effect. Much of it is positive, but the effect on politics is very unclear. I mean, you have a number of trends in Indian media, one of which is the rightward drift in television news, and one of the big characters in my book is Arnab Goswami, who I guess many of you will now hear groans from the Indians in the audience. He's the kind of Sean Hannity or Bill O'Reilly of India, and a media tycoon. So that you have the rightwards drift, but you also have sort of the Indian social media sphere, which in some ways is a very positive phenomenon and has given voice to people who didn't have a voice and is extraordinarily popular amongst young people, but politically has created this poisonous swamp of kind of political discussion online that I think is in many ways much worse than you get in Western countries. And so that's now just a part and parcel of Indian democracy, that you have this kind of rather unpleasant online discussion, some of which happens on Twitter and some of which is happening in a more semi-private realm on WhatsApp and other platforms.
I have a feeling that we're going to have a lot more questions in this panel than usually, and we usually put aside 15 minutes. So should we do the rest of the discussion through taking questions? Is that all right with both of you?
Yeah.
But before we do that,
any billionaires in the audience? Come on, you can admit it.
Them.
This is a well-heeled looking crowd.
Before we take questions, can we have a quick update on the score, please? Prashant?
Sorry?
Oh, it's all over. All right, very good.
Commiserations to all Pakistani friends in the audience. There you are. I can see you. I can see some of you. I don't know all of you. Okay, so let's take some questions.
We have one on the left here.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to pick on something. You said the compromises that some of these politicians have to make in order to accommodate the money that they need to raise.
Yeah, so I mean, so in the book I have a kind of page or two where, again, deeply anonymized, the sort of choices that you face. So let's imagine you want to be a Lok Sabha politician. There's some circumstances, most of the political parties don't have very much money, and so one of the reasons why there's been such an influx of criminality into Indian politics over the last 10 or 20 years, which again has got worse. So literally, if you look at the figures, I think now a quarter of Lok Sabha MPs have criminal records, and a slightly smaller proportion of that have very serious criminal records. And part of the reason for that is that criminality is associated with money. These are kind of people who've made money the hard way, and they bring money into political parties. So basically, if you wanted to be what I was told was you had a kind of choice. Either you found a kind of sugar daddy, you found a local businessman who you vaguely trusted, and you thought that they might give you basically most of the money that you needed, and you just hoped that they didn't come and ask you to do anything that was too compromising later. So you kind of basically asked for an act of civic charity and hoped they didn't come and screw you. Or you had to set up a kind of pyramid scheme in which you, as a Lok Sabha politician, recruited a network of lower level politicians, and you relied on them to get the money, and you didn't ask very much about where they got it from. So you had to kind of set up a feeder system of people who could raise small amounts of money from however you did that. And that some measure of that was kind of those were your options, in addition to, if you were very lucky, getting a bit of money from the central parties. But typically I was told you had to raise it all yourself. So that was kind of, what you had to do. Find yourself a local rich person who had to be a business person and hope that they didn't ask for too much, or set up a franchise operation or some mix of the two.
It's worth pointing out, though, in this, that part of the challenge for any candidate in an election is the sheer size of the parliamentary constituency in India. The fact that the UK Parliament has more MPs than India, compare the sizes of the two countries. The average size of a UK parliamentary constituency is 1/20th the size of an Indian parliamentary constituency. So actually the sheer mechanics and resources required to reach voters is just so much more enormous that you can see why the time and money and energy required is that much greater. Okay, we had a question here. Yeah.
Yeah, could James or Avi comment on the question of the withdrawal of currency? So 2 years ago, 80% of currency...
Demonetization.
Demonetization, right.
Now, it was 70%.
Yeah, we need a microphone.
Microphone here, please.
So I'm asking the question in relation to demonetization. At the time, about 18 months ago or 2 years ago, it was said by the government this was more or less to do with reducing corruption. The net effect of it was to reduce on a huge scale the amount of cash stored privately, and that cash was apparently substituted for bank accounts. validated by biometric records. So my question is whether or not, A, the intention of the government was genuine. Was this really connected with anti-corruption? And B, what has been the net effect?
Avi, do you want to?
Well, I'll start with it. The net effect is that all the money came back, the sort of cash out there. And I have my personal opinions on the constitutionality of taking what is basically a contract with the government. Cash is your contract with the government, so it is a form of taking. But, anecdotally, and there hasn't been enough study of this, it was the greatest money laundering operation in history.
Yeah.
Right, because all the money came back. Obviously, the money was not held by people who legitimately had it, because our economy has been off the books. A large proportion or some proportion of it has been off the books. So when it came back, there was a percentage of it was kept by middlemen. It made, in my opinion, a lot of bank managers corrupt because it needed their connivance. It led to a lot of round tripping of money back in through foreign direct investment. So all of that, has happened, and it's going to take a lot of time to figure out how it all came back in. But yes, so money came back into the system one way or the other, and it was legitimized, which is why I call it the greatest money laundering operation in
I think
history of
your
mankind.
question, sir, is a good one. Because, I don't think there's now any doubt that economically demonetization was a complete fiasco. I think any sort of sane person, even in the BJP now, will admit that this was a mistake. But what the original intention was, it remains an interesting question. So what were they thinking? And I suppose I think that there was a genuine misguided sense that this, if you look back at Modi's speeches when he justified it, it had a real kind of religious tinge to it. He talked about this in as a kind of cleansing operation, as you would a kind of ritual, which worried a lot of people because it had a kind of RSS sort of language about it. But I think genuinely that was what they thought they were trying to do. And even though economically it turned out to be a complete disaster, it tapped into a real feeling of anger that existed and still exists in India about the corruption of the elite. And so this was Modi's most populist. He's often accused of being a populist. This was his most purely populist act, in which he tried to turn the great mass of ordinary people against a kind of nameless and shapeless, corrupt elite. And so people had in mind all of the enemies that they knew were kind of on the take, the bribe-taking policeman, the corrupt bureaucrat, the politician who you thought was meant to be elected to help you and didn't. And so the reason why, for a time at least, the demonetization was extremely inconvenient but broadly popular was that Modi had tapped into this anger that stretched from the bottom of society at least up into the upper middle classes, that the rules were being rigged by these kind of nameless people in power and so that was why, in a sense, he didn't get punished for what was probably the greatest peacetime economic mistake since the Second World War.
And it's also because some of those things were hidden from the public. For instance, the fact that the new notes appeared mysteriously in the pockets of the ruling party before they were actually issued to the public. So the new notes, 2,000 rupee notes, were already there's some people reported, like The Wire, that they were already there with the ruling party while the opposition lost its cash at a time when the UP was about to go to polls, which is the largest state, which has the largest number of seats. Anyway, my question was actually to do with when you compare the corruption of the previous government to the corruption of this government. I hope in your book you talk about the new method of corruption, which is murder. Because there have been numerous cases of murders that have happened. I mean, you look at Madhya Pradesh, where more than 50 people were killed in the Vyapam scam, all related to the Vyapam scam of the Madhya Pradesh government. And more than 50 people who were either witnesses or whistleblowers were killed. And so this is I don't think this has been properly analyzed, that is no longer the old-fashioned ways of covering up corruption. It's just murder.
So there were so many scams that I couldn't put them all in the book, which was a sort of, it was a great rich picking ground. But I mean, the point that you mentioned is an interesting one. So over the years of the first Modi government, with one exception, which is the current farrago over French fighter jets, and again, my friend Mr. Anil Ambani, there hasn't been very many of the national level mega scams that there were in the sort of penultimate Congress government. But as you say, if you go down to this sort of mid-level at the states, there are still any number of very significant corruption scandals, of which this education-related scandal in Madhya Pradesh was a very significant one. And although many of these occur not as fully in the national spotlight, many of them are much more brutal than the ones that occur in Delhi. So,
I mean, I'll only disagree with you in one respect on that. I don't think that there's been any mega scam reported or a criminal case registered for in the Modi regime, rather than there hasn't been. Exactly. I mean, you don't get 60,000 crores, most of it going to the ruling party, without there being some sort of corruption happening. So there has been an underreporting that you can talk about, the independence of the media. There has been an under-enforcement of corruption, and therein there is a lot of stories about the competence and or the independence of the anti-corruption bodies. So those are two different things which has to be studied.
And if I can add one additional factor to this, what was extraordinary about the 2019 elections was the incapacity of the political opposition to make these electoral issues. I mean, did we hear about the Vyapam scam being discussed at any point? No, I think, we've said this often enough. It's true, the media is controlled, but there are ways of making these election issues. No media is stopping electoral speeches being made on particular issues, and they were not electoral issues. And that therein lies a real dysfunction in Indian politics at the moment, that the political opposition is incapable of making these an issue as well, which is a harsh but bitter truth. Okay, let's,
Yep.
There are questions at the back. This lady here. Oh, Nadir, okay. Yeah.
Right. So I didn't want to divert your attention away from India, but since you mentioned Pakistan-India cricket match, now we have a prime minister in Pakistan who won World Cup in 1992, and he
You're
campaigned.
just going to slip that in, right?
Yeah.
Regardless.
And he campaigned on a single point agenda, which was anti-corruption, since he formed his party in '97.
Yeah.
And in Pakistan, we see that the corruption has been used to malign politicians. And there's a clause, Article 60 to 63, which means if you are not truthful, not honest, you're going to be disqualified. The main party leaders are imprisoned. So how do you draw parallels with Pakistan, where the corruption has been used as a tool by the military establishment to malign politicians, and it's like a hanging sword. If you apply Article 60 to 63, more than half of the parliament will be disqualified. So how do you draw parallels between Pakistan and India on this?
Well, so I have been to Pakistan a few times, but I'm not an expert on it. I guess what I would say is one of the things I wanted to do in the book, and I do deal in cricket. There's a whole chapter on cricket and corruption in cricket, which is one of the kind of great examples of crony capitalism in the Indian system, is the money and corruption that came into the game of cricket. But I suppose on corruption across South Asia and across Eastern Asia, which is where I now live, corruption is a kind of normal part of economic development. There have been no countries that have grown rich without corruption. The subtitle of my book was A Journey Through India's New Gilded Age, and I make a kind of analogy that others have also made between India today and America after the Civil War in the latter 19th century, but this is true of Korea. I mean, Pakistan is a kind of particularly different case because of the relationship between the civilian government and the military, and the way in which kind of money is siphoned off by the political class and the military class. But my point was a broader one, which is that although India undeniably has a major problem with corruption, it is not unusual in that respect. In fact, it's perfectly normal almost all countries that are at that stage that India is going through, a very rapid early industrialization and urbanization, also have had enormous wealth creation at the very top and rampantly corrupt politics. And the hope is that as you can't get to Denmark or Sweden in one leap, but that gradually as you develop and the middle class takes more control of politics, then the corruption and corruption is driven out of the system and governance improves. That is not always the way. You look at Russia, which is a reasonably wealthy country, and that hasn't happened. And I suppose the problem for Pakistan is, the question is whether or not the kind of the way that its politics works will end up being able to develop because of the role that the army plays in civilian life. So.
If I could just jump in on this before, because I think it's a very dangerous tool, using anti-corruption laws to delegitimize political choices is deeply problematic for democracy. And I'll use an analogy which is just coming out in the news, which is former President Lula in Brazil, which is now coming out, and a lot of Brazilian commentators have written, was a conspiracy between certain parts of the judiciary and the establishment to take him out of the electoral choice, so that you would have, a very different kind of politician now being president of Brazil. And that leads, corruption, of course, in a system where there is no public financing, there is a certain level of corruption which is necessary for politicians to exist. It then you can use it to target who you don't like, and if you control certain levers of enforcement, then you can really have a very debilitating effect on democracy.
Yeah. There's one more thing, and there's a certain class of kind of leftist academic who I read in researching the book, who will claim that, in a sense, corruption is an upper middle. These accusations of corruption, which in Pakistan are made by the military against civilians, in many countries are made by the upper middle classes against the lower classes. And if you look, corruption can be a kind of ladder of opportunity. You look at somebody like Mayawati in Uttar Pradesh, many of the regional leaders, they're all rampantly corrupt, but they're using that corruption in a kind of clientelist way to benefit a constituency that has been previously marginalized. And so you will find people making the argument that in a sense, that these accusations of corruption are a way of holding on to power, whether that is in Pakistan amongst the military or amongst now I didn't entirely agree with that argument, but reasonably respectable people will make it. So.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm diverting you and bringing it to UK, Britain. Corruption is a serious topic here as well. And what is a corporate corruption is very, very serious. And also, what is happening is Asians are participating in this process. And I often think racism is a form of corruption. And also, what I want to say is organizations like Financial Ombudsman doesn't work for ordinary people. And what they do is hold up corruption. And I will give you an example.
Let's stop with that. There are more questions waiting.
Just quickly, Financial Ombudsman, I applied to European Ombudsman, and then they said, is Financial Ombudsman a European organization? What a weird question. Britain is part of EU. Why can't Financial Ombudsman be not part of European Ombudsman?
Thank you.
So that's kind of, those are corruption issues. Thank you very much.
Yes, and I do.
There's a really good point, a book that a friend of mine, Oliver Bullough, wrote called Moneyland, which you should go out and buy. And he makes the basic point that it's very unfair, actually, people like me, to look at developing economies and say they are very corrupt, because the enablers of that corruption are London, the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and so these are two sides of the same coin. So to be properly accurate, the reason why all of the dodgy Indian billionaires park their money in London or New York is because there is this international financial ecosystem which is run by and in the interests of the rich countries. And that often has a quite debilitating effect on poor countries. So, I suppose I just want to say that I recognize that, and while my book was about corruption in India, these are two sides of the same coin, and you shouldn't let the supposedly well-governed countries that come at the top of the corruption league tables, where the UK does very well, which are enabling the corruption that you find in emerging markets.
Or for instance, if you have a state-owned Norwegian telecom company, do a joint venture with a dodgy Indian real estate company, and then say, we didn't realize that this was a corrupt telecom license. How could we have possibly known?
Okay. Please, can I request you to keep your questions brief? Yeah, thank you.
My question was about I vaguely read some stuff about Russian interference in the last Indian election. And
ooh, I didn't know about that. Tell us more.
I was obsessively reading about Trump, and I was diverted by one kind of a couple of mentions of it. And I wondered, what would be the point of Putin trying to kind of be a puppeteer, a string puller in India when there's a very wealthy, varied interest trying to do the same, and kind of the same data knowledge as well growing?
Okay.
That was a vague question, but you know what I mean.
No, we get what you mean. Let's have here in the purple, up in front. I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions together. Here.
Oh, we've got one with a microphone at the back. So there we are.
Sorry.
Can
okay.
shall I just pop it in quickly now? Just a
go.
really quick one.
Go on.
I can't see you. Yeah.
Hello.
Mandeep, just
Looking from the outside in to India, the view that we've often had through books and films has been, the traditional poor kids living in a rubbish dump. Increasingly now it's Ambani weddings and billionaires. What can you tell us about the people in the middle and their prospects?
Okay, and let's take this third question, and then you can.
Thank you. It was a great panel. One thing we haven't touched upon is philanthropy and giving back by these billionaires, whether corrupt or not corrupt. Can we touch upon that too?
Thank you. Okay, so Russia, middle class, and philanthropy.
I've never heard of any accusation that Russia meddled in India's election, and God love them if they want to try. I mean, it'd be a hell of a thing to try and influence. But I mean, there are legitimate worries about interference in Asian democratic elections, in which China rather than Russia tends to be the one that is fingered. But I've never heard of that being a problem in India. Although, as was intimated earlier, there's great fear in India, normally kind of preposterously misplaced, about the role of the foreign hand. That's typically American-funded NGOs that are seen to be kind of coming over and nefariously funding things, but not the Russians.
Well, the Soviet Union always used to fund one particular political party
I suppose that's true.
for a long time.
But the footnote to that is, what we do know is Cambridge Analytica came to India and left. They didn't stay to
they were like, there is absolutely no corruption we can bring here that is not already indigenous to the nation. we have nothing to learn from these.
The second question about middle class.
Well, the philanthropy was interesting. So particularly, I went on a book tour to promote this, and in the US, I got 2 questions, which was, what about the caste system, and what about philanthropy? And I kind of regret particularly not doing something about philanthropy, because it's a great example of the sort of contradiction of Indian wealth. Because on the one hand, you have a long-lived and very admirable tradition of Indian philanthropy. All of you who are from India or have been there will have seen Tata hospitals and Birla Cancer Institutes. And so there's a deep tradition of social responsibility in India, which I think is partly to do with the nature of the country and partly to do with simply being a poor country, that you can't avoid. It's very difficult to kind of sequester yourself from poverty in India. And so people do feel a genuine sense of social responsibility that I think is greater than you would get in many Western countries. On the other hand, many of these philanthropic organizations are a racket. It's an open secret that the dodgier the business organization, the more likely it is that the philanthropic arm is run by the wife of the tycoon, is used to give grants to buy off opposition groups next to the steel plant, or it's basically a form of corruption. And that was why India has what looks on the surface to be a very progressive law where 2% of net profits of any large business have to be given for corporate social responsibility. And very reasonable people thought this was a very terrible idea, because in a sense you were opening up a floodgate and putting it into institutions that had no transparency, and many of which were simply slush funds for the tycoons to kind of buy off their opponents. And so you had the same contradiction that you often get in many other areas of Indian life, that there's a lot to admire in Indian philanthropy, but there's a lot that was very problematic as well.
Yeah, and one thing is the government is wants money, but it wants it spent in very traditional forms of philanthropy, which is hospitals, free medicine, distributing food. It doesn't want it in a freer media. So they've actually amended the Income Tax Act to take away the tax benefit if you don't give to traditional forms of charity.
And so B's question about the middle class, it's not so, I wasn't writing about the middle class in the book. What I suppose the thing to know about the Indian middle class is much smaller than you think. For those of you who are not from India, what people in the West would recognize as middle class in India is probably only about 15 or 20 million people out of a population of 1.3 billion. But over the next 10 or 20 years, that's going to be one of the most important stories in the world, that this group is going to grow to about 200, 300 million people. I suppose what interested me was that the anti-corruption movement and the reaction against the tycoons, the new super rich, was predominantly a middle and upper middle class phenomenon. The lower you went down the social strata, the more likely you were to find people who were unquestionably admiring of people like Mukesh Ambani or Vijay Mallya. The people who found these figures to be very problematic were not just kind of Delhi intellectuals, but people in the middle and upper middle classes who wanted the rules to be run fairly and were suspicious of people who appeared to be bending them. And that's exactly the same pattern that you saw in somewhere like America in the Gilded Age, where the strongest reaction against the robber baron tycoons came from the emerging urban middle classes of cities like New York and Chicago. And in a sense, it was that reaction that eventually brought the tycoons to heel, and probably will eventually do so in India as well.
Okay, I'm going to take a final round of questions. So the lady over there. Is there anyone in this part of the audience? Okay. Yeah. No, I'm looking to the left. Yeah. I'll take 3 questions, please. Speak into, we can't hear you.
Can't hear you. Yell, or you can yell.
Just one of the questions was, what can actually be done to tackle corruption? Given that even in the UK, you've got, Jack Straw's reporting camera, you've got lobbying, you've got you've got it's not as if just having a developed prevent corruption.
Okay.
Okay. What can be done?
Okay.
Well, I'm going to ask you a question on the lighter side. Did you get to visit any of the new emerging Bollywood millionaires?
And did you have a question? You're standing up, so I'm assuming you're impatient to ask a question.
Yeah.
That'll be the final question.
That's not working, that mic.
Yell.
Social responsibility of Indian billionaires was equivalent to those in the West. Would India still be a major recipient of overseas aid from the British, German, Norwegian governments for poverty there?
Oh. India doesn't receive any aid from the British government.
ODA, it receives ODA aid.
It does from the British. I think it still does. It picks only few countries to receive aid from. I think the British government is still one of them.
No different aid goes to India.
It doesn't, yeah?
No.
Okay.
The Brits were very keen, but the Indians said they didn't want it.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have a question about, can we do something about corruption? Bollywood billionaires and DFID.
I think in corruption, people have looked to anti-corruption laws and looked to sort of, and there's certainly a role anti-corruption laws can play in punishing corruption, taking over major scams. But if you look at the percentage of society which pays even a small bribe, right, and it's too large to use laws to change corruption in India. They can only selectively prosecute. You can't prosecute everybody who's given a bribe. You can't even prosecute in India everybody who's taken a bribe, because you can't prosecute 10% of the population, let alone a lot more. So I think this has to be a different kind of movement. And often it is the law that's looked upon, but it has to be something outside the law. The law is insufficient.
Did you want to take any of the others? Okay, yeah, maybe James.
Yeah, well, so the Bollywood question, I don't know if there are any Bollywood billionaires. One of the joys of being a foreign correspondent in India is I did get to write some Bollywood stories, the business of Bollywood. So I got to interview Deepika Padukone, she was very pleased to be interviewed by the FT, I'm sure. and I had a bit part in a Salman Khan movie in which I played British diplomat number 2.
Not one.
No, British, in the strict tradition of cinematic realism for which Bollywood is justly famed, British diplomat number 2 was played by a thickly accented Swiss man called Bernard, who delivered I think his line was, "Her Majesty will be very pleased that you have come." But I mean, Bollywood used to be and probably still is. I mean, the financing of Bollywood movies it certainly was, and I think probably remains deeply dodgy. I mean, it's sort of, as with many filmmaking industries, it's highly untransparent. But anyway, none of that in the book. The question of what can be done. So, Francis Fukuyama talks about, in his kind of epic books about political development over the course of human history, talks about the move from a patrimonial to a non-patrimonial society, by which he means a constitutional order in which you do not favor one group or another. So you think about your classic, sadly, African model of kind of crony capitalism in which one tribal grouping controls the government, and it's like Michaela Wrong's book, Now It Is Our Time to Eat. And so the state is captured by one group or another and then used in their own interest. And so what you're trying to move is to a situation in which when the state is taken by one party, that party does not simply act in its own interest, it acts in the national interest. And Fukuyama says this is much more difficult as a transition than moving from being a poor country to a rich country. So creating a state which is neutral between groups is probably the most difficult challenge of any kind of human development, which is to say that India shouldn't feel too bad that it hasn't cracked it, because everybody struggles with this. What can you do? There are all sorts of interesting ideas. So the former chief economic advisor of India had the idea that you could decriminalize receiving a bribe. So you continue to criminalize
giving a bribe.
Decriminalize giving a bribe. So taking it remains a problem, but you wouldn't get criminalized if you gave a bribe, so that people were more likely to admit that they'd done it. I mean, I think the most important thing is to try and drive money out of politics. That in the end, it's not the idea that India cannot plausibly become, I don't know, Holland or Sweden, in which you have a kind of small, cheap democracy run partially funded by the state. It has to become it is already a large, expensive democracy like America, and is going to get more so. But there are things that you can do to introduce at least a level of transparency into that system, so you begin to know who is giving money to whom, and then you have a reasonable inference of what the quid pro quo might be behind that. America's democracy is not perfect by any means, but I think that's really the only plausible option. And if you could do that, then that would be a big step towards at least bringing some level of transparency and accountability.
I don't know why we don't say Italy is also a plausible option, where there's still high levels of corruption and is relatively developed in Europe.
Okay, I think that brings us to the end of
There was a
this
question
discussion. We've run out of time.
We've run out of time. Thank you. A big round of applause for James Crabtree, Avi Singh, and Mukulika Banerjee.